we talked a lot about, you know, what is the idea that we will hang this on, and to a certain extent we thought, you know, is the orchid too corny? It's the national flower of Singapore. I mean, orchids are very adept at adapting to extraordinary, unusual and harsh conditions. And you know, they're very efficient with their infrastructure.
And once you decide to build two 12,000 square metre glass conservatories, or they might have been something about conservatories, then there's a lot of other stuff.
They could easily have been separate buildings, and they were definitively not. They were part of the landscape, shapes and forms and leaves and petals and patterns, because of what Andrew did in terms of his organisational orchid.
To turn the typology of a glasshouse on its head, because the glasshouses of our part of the world, the Northern Hemisphere, typically are there to keep plants warm. Yes. I mean, you're generally there as a big solar collector to keep plants warm, and of course the issue we have in Singapore is that it's always hot and sticky. So actually we were building an enclosure to keep plants cool.
Yeah, actually, if you stand back and say, build two cooled conservatories in the middle of Singapore, I mean, it's madness.
In the original competition submission, we decided that we were going to dry the air using these things called desiccants, which are chemicals that dry the air out. And the intention was that the super trees would be clad in lots of solar panels that would then produce the heat to dry the desiccants. When we went to look at some desiccant installations, we found that there were significant problems with the sun coming in and out and the sudden huge burst of energy it gave into the systems. And so we were struggling to make the solar-powered desiccant work. And I had a conversation with the CEO of, the then CEO of NParks, who was bemoaning the fact that he had to look after these 3 million trees in Singapore and was producing hundreds of tons of wood waste every day that he didn't quite know what to do with. So at that point we switched the whole strategy for the gardens. Once we discovered about the huge amount of bio-waste that was available in Singapore from the National Parks Board, we kind of moved it on to a more sophisticated diagram, or a more technical diagram, where we've ended up with one of the largest biomass boiler plants I would think in private use anywhere in the world. It's a 7.5 megawatt boiler plant, which generates steam, which drives a turbine, which makes power, and the waste heat from that turbine goes into two different chiller cycles. And the absorption chiller, which is basically taking heat and generating cooling, is used to drive the conservatories. And then the secondary waste heat from that is used as part of a desiccant process to regenerate desiccants, which are drying the air. We also take solar energy from the glass houses, so the heat that comes into here and heats up the air makes the air at the top of the glass houses very hot. That gets extracted and drawn back through, and is also part of the desiccant regeneration process. So there's a cycle going on here in terms of desiccants and drying. There's a cycle in terms of vegetation. All of the waste and the waste ash from the wood burning process, going right back to the very first diagrams, becomes part of the fertilizer system. So we have two levels of organic fertilizer waste that go out. One goes into the gardens and one goes off-site to be mixed as part of a cement production process. We often get asked the question, why would you build a glass house and then put so much shading on the outside of it? And it's all really rooted in the fact that the plants need light, and the plants can grow well when they receive something like 45,000 lux of light level for more than 500 hours a year. So 450 lux would be a right level for an office space. We basically had to set the facade up of the building so it could deal with the long hours of cloudy weather. And in that period we have the shades out of the way, and the glass is letting as much light as it can onto the plants. Once the sun comes out, you get the full tropical heat, something like 1100 watts, 1.1 kilowatts per square metre of glass. We need to try and filter out the heat, let the light through, and then at a certain point we just have more heat than the air conditioning system can cope with. At that point we deploy the shades to prevent the direct solar game getting in and either damaging the plants through too much heat, too much energy, but also to provide oases for people inside the space. So the shades on the outside also prevent you from having to stand in direct sunshine. So it's just like if you're sitting outside in a terrace, you go and sit under the umbrella to get out of direct sunshine. In essence, it's a responsive skin, because the climate is changing.
Once you've decided you're having a shading system, then what you do is fight to get the least amount of structure or the least amount of surface in the way of the light to get to the plants. Now, grid shells are fantastic structures to span very large areas because they work on the basis of shells. Very thin surfaces using double curvature to give them stiffness. The problem that you get on the scale of the thing we're talking about here, and we're talking about 120, 130 metre span, is to keep the grid shell as light as possible. It's very, very, very good at supporting its own weight as a three-dimensional surface. And in that condition, you get the curvature of the thing providing its own support, but the minute you blow wind at it, sideways, it buckles. So we had to find a system that combined two structural ideas together to give you the lightness of the grid shell, but the stiffness of a structure capable of supporting both its weight and the wind. And we came up with this idea of these series of arches which span across the grid shell.
To deliver the idea of perpetual spring, which was the environmental brief, that they could fool the plants into replete flowering by dropping the temperature significantly.
Creating the unique problem to these conservatories, which no other building would have in Singapore, or in fact anywhere else, where you working in temperatures in the day on the equator of upwards of 50 degrees in the day, and we had to drop it down at night time for this ignition temperature of the plants, which creates this enormous temperature difference, and then a piece of steel 130 metres long expands and contracts enormously.
What the skin does is it gives us about 65% of the incident daylight comes through as visible light, but only about 35% of the infrared energy, which is the heat energy, comes through the outer skins.
We realised that actually it was always warm at the top, because the place that the cool was happening was at the lower point. Because of stratification, it works wonderfully. The shape of the structure, the shape of the garden, with the kind of terrace, allowed the cool air to tumble in and to work well at the bottom.
Any of the familiar models of conservatory, you throw open the windows on a sunny day or on a hot day, and they ventilate. And on a winter day, you shut the windows and you crank up the radiators. Not too complicated. Here we had a whole, much more complex situation with radiative heat exchange, with human comfort, with getting the right amount of air movement. I'm sure these people aren't so aware of it, but there's a whole lot of environmental things going on right here, where these people are walking on the concrete paths, which have a whole net of pipes. Normally, they would heat up and re-radiate, but we actually take the energy away, the heat energy away, through cool water running through the paths.
The joyous thing, of course, is that once you've decided that the cold air ponds,
Stratifies.
lays at the bottom, stratifies, the really perverse thing is then to put a mountain in it, which would typically expect to get colder as you go up. So we then had an interesting debate as to how to keep the mountain cold at the top once we'd broken into the layers of gradual heat. But it's the whole idea that the mountain is not just a big mound of earth, it's a whole building.
We couldn't get the air humid enough just by pumping in moist air, so there are misters at the top, which are very much like a misty morning on a tropical rainforest, and it's absolutely magical when you go up there. Just this great sort of foggy moistness in the air, which is just fantastic to walk through and experience.
The sandwich between the structure and the envelope and all of this sort of handling stuff beneath it and structures and all sort of things is the zone where there's plants and there are people sort of inhabiting. So how do you showcase them? How do you actually deal with several million visitors a year? In the flower dome, the idea is actually to treat it almost like a theatre. You go in, there's a spectacle, there's a big sort of auditorium in a way, and then you find your way through. And in the Cloud Forest Dome, you have a much more immersive three-dimensional experience. You take to the top of the mountain and then come through it. The Cloud Mountain is almost like galleries. There's sort of multimedia galleries that can be programmed in different ways. You can use it in different ways. So to deliver all of these ideas and these things, these functions, we've had to rethink the idea of the conservatory and how that fits into a 21st century public garden. One of the starting points for thinking about super trees was tropical vertical gardens. Bernard Marx, a long time ago, started using sort of bromeliads and some of the epiphytic plants for a rainforest in a vertical way. We just thought we could push it a little bit harder and sort of really make something of a real scale. Because the scale of these is really significant. We wanted something right at the heart of the garden that actually would complement the conservatories, but work in the scale of the city. It's a sort of an emerging sort of idea that actually we can learn a lot about how to develop in 21st century urban developments from natural processes. You know, that was one of the sort of underpinning ideas for what became the super tree. It wasn't called that to start with, it was just, you know, the idea of this sort of fantastic vertical form where we could showcase tropical plants on a vertical scale that hadn't been seen before.
How does one create a structure, an infrastructure onto which you can build vertical gardens? Well, we had the chimneys. They need to be relatively strong themselves to stand up in the wind. What evolved was the idea of a skin on the outside of this chimney to perhaps hide the fact that it is a chimney, make it more beautiful, and use it to the benefit of having that stiff structure and support the gardens up it. What was a kind of thin core developed into an extended canopy. The canopy is the upside down version of a membrane structure, conical surface in membranes, which is three-dimensional, i.e. opposed curvature, but unlike the conservatories, which is synclastic, yet the curvature is opposite, which is anticlastic.
This climate for engineers and for designers to throw up their hands as a sense of almost hopelessness. That you think, well, this climate is so tough to work in that there's nothing you can do about it. That you kind of think, how on earth do you compete with what nature is throwing at you in terms of sunlight, humidity, moisture, rain, all those things. And I think that it's all about possibilities.
Singaporeans who can experience effectively, because they are so big, 12,000 square metres, of being outside at 20 degrees.
There are ways that you can deal with these issues that don't cost the earth, that don't demand huge amounts of energy consumption to make them happen. What's so great about this project is we were given the opportunity and the tools in some ways through a great client who let us take these things a very long way to build something that, you know, actually says to Singapore, it's not just about a consumptive lifestyle. You can actually make a regenerative lifestyle and a restorative lifestyle.
Perhaps surprising for us as well. I mean, it's showing us about how differently people can think about using spaces, both during the day and during at night. Some sort of refreshing, renewing an idea about how you use public space.
I think the really great thing about this is that there is so much emotional response here. The trees are super trees, the nature is super nature. It is all slightly exaggerated, which gives people the opportunity and allows people to see things in a new way.